A new leader for the Greens as Sussan Ley and David Littleproud meet to find a way forward for the coalition. And the PM lands in Indonesia. I'm Pablo Vinales, live from the lands of the Ngunnawal people. Welcome to Afternoon Briefing. 2 weeks post-election, the final leadership struggle has been decided. The Greens naming Larissa Waters as their new leader. In a post-Bant era, does the minor party need a new direction? And what should they prioritise with the power they hold in the Senate? We speak with Independent Senator and former Greens member Lydia Thorpe. Opposition leader Sussan Ley claims the climate wars are over, but with the coalition putting net zero targets up for review, is that true? We'll ask Independent MP Allegra Spender. And Prime Minister Anthony Albanese lands in Indonesia, but is Australia being ambitious enough in our bilateral relationship? We're joined by Professor Hal Hill from the ANU College of Asia and the Pacific. The Greens' new look leadership team walked out arm in arm earlier following a meeting where it was decided Larissa Waters would become the party's leader. She was unanimously selected as the party's leader in an uncontested ballot. Senator Mehreen Faruqi will remain as deputy leader. Senator Waters spoke to the media following this decision.
Elizabeth Watson-Brown, Libby Watson-Brown returned in the seat of Ryan in Queensland, and we got so close in a number of House seats to turn those seats green. Greens are in two-party preferred now in more seats than ever before. So, folks, we'll be back. We're here and we continue to show up for the community and continue to try to represent them and their interests. So it's been an absolutely humbling day, and this is a big job, but I will give it my very best. And I'm proud that we have such strong women leading this party.
So to unpack this latest development, I'm joined now by our political reporter, Jake Evans. Jake, welcome back to the program. So what do we know about Queensland Senator Larissa Waters?
Yeah, good afternoon, Pablo. Well, Larissa Waters is now the fifth leader of the Greens, and she's one of the longest serving in their team now. She came in the 2010 election alongside Adam Bant, who obviously faced a shock defeat at the most recent federal election. And she made a comment in that press conference this afternoon that I think gives a pretty good indication of probably what her focuses are going to be heading into this term of Parliament. She was an environment lawyer before entering Parliament, and she said that as an environment lawyer and as a feminist, those are things that she would be seeking to progress this term. And that's what we've seen largely over her parliamentary career. She's held a number of environment and climate portfolios in her time, as well as being the spokesperson for Women for the Party. One of the things that she's most well recognised for was being the first person in Parliament to breastfeed in 2016, and that was shortly after rules were changed over some troubles with former Liberal Kelly O'Dwyer, having troubles with her own child in Parliament. And so that made global headlines when it happened, but a few other policy issues in that space that she's closely associated with. She was a fierce campaigner to have the tampon tax lifted. That was the 10% goods and services tax that was applied on menstrual products. That was something that she was closely associated with, and also instrumental in a number of inquiries in terms of reproductive rights, access to reproductive health care, and to menopause treatment as well in Parliament. So likely to see more of that from Larissa Waters in this term. The other thing that she's also well known for perhaps is in the 2017 dual citizenship crisis that rolled through this Parliament and knocked out a number of MPs. Larissa Waters learned that she actually wasn't a lifelong Queenslander so much as she thought, that because she was born in Canada and had spent the first 11 months of her life there, she actually had, unknown to her, Canadian citizenship, had to resign, and then re-entered Parliament in 2018.
Obviously quite a varied career in politics. So the Greens are remaining positive, even though they are hurting. They did go backwards in terms of losses in seats in the House of Representatives. What sort of challenges do you think Larissa Waters will be facing now as leader?
Yeah, so the Greens publicly put on a brave face, but the defeat of Adam Bandt in Melbourne was a shock to them. It wasn't something that they had planned for, and so they are still putting the pieces together somewhat, and they acknowledge that there are lessons for them in this campaign, but they say win, lose or draw, it was something they were going to review anyway, and it will be interesting to see how Larissa Waters approaches this term of Parliament. We've certainly heard, particularly towards the end of the last term, more conversation about the Greens' tactics, how they were approaching particularly bills in the Senate, how hardline a stance to take against government and you know, where they wanted to put up a fight versus waving things through. Now, the Greens still say they're not going to be a rubber stamp for Labor, even though they talk about being the sole balance of power in the Senate, in their words. Well, fundamentally, the negotiations remain pretty similar to what they were last term, and so you know, the picture hasn't changed so much for the government in terms of how it passes legislation, and the Greens know this privately, and so that's something they'll be thinking about as they consider how to take this next term. But Larissa Waters is seen as something of a middle path within this progressive party, and so it will be interesting to see, I guess, where she takes this party next in terms of how hardline they'll go.
We've obviously seen a lot of factional infighting in the major parties, but what do we know about Larissa Waters being the choice in the party room today? Their kind of process, the Greens' process, has been likened to the conclave. It is somewhat secretive. They try and come to an agreement?
Yeah, so the green smoke going up today, I mean, we were told it was an uncontested ballot. That doesn't mean that it's not a competitive process, and certainly, you know, the Greens were there was some hustling in the days leading up to this. We know that Mehreen Faruqi, Sarah Hanson-Young both also would have been keen to take on the leadership, but the party is quite small. They know that they're fragile. Larissa was part of the brutal infighting that spilled out into the public domain in the sort of mid-2010s when Lee Rhiannon, the then New South Wales Senator, was sort of unanimously referred to the party's sort of national executive over their concerns around her. And I think the party learned lessons from that. It doesn't want its rather secretive internal dealings spilling out into the public again. And so we saw today a pretty united front. Certainly Larissa is seen as a bit of a unifier for the party. And additionally, you know, we saw largely the leadership structure remain in place. So Sarah Hanson-Young remaining Manager of Government Business. We saw Mehreen Faruqi maintaining her role as deputy. So it suggests generally pretty happy across this party to keep things as they are, not radically upend things after Adam Bandt's defeat.
Now, Jake, before we let you go, you've done a really pretty alarming but fascinating story about seabirds on Lord Howe Island. They've become so full of plastic that researchers are now actually hearing them crunch. So what have researchers found here?
Yeah, it's pretty gross, Pablo. There's a team of researchers who've been studying these birds called mutton birds out on Lord Howe Island. They're goofy little shearwaters, and Dr. Jennifer Lavers, one of the team who have been studying them, she's been going for 18 years and looking at the contents of the stomachs of these birds and seeing year after year more and more plastic. And I had a chat with her while she was out on Lord Howe Island last month, where they broke a record, a mutton bird found with 778 pieces of plastic in its belly. It's about a fifth of that bird's body weight. And so she's raising the alarm. She says this is a sentinel species for you know, a bigger global plastic problem. And she enlisted the help of Green Senator Peter Whish-Wilson, coincidentally, who came along to see it for himself. He was equally alarmed and said it was a shocking sight for him, something that he would hope all politicians could see, including the new Environment Minister, Murray Watt, who he asked to go and visit and see for himself.
Yeah, Jake, it's a really good story on our website as well and running on News Channel today. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Pablo.
Ahead of the 2022 election, Labor promised to establish a national environment watchdog and committed to nature protection laws. But a deal with the Greens was killed off by the Prime Minister after lobbying from WA Premier Roger Cook. Resources Minister Madeleine King says the environmental reforms remain a priority.
we will achieve that reform. And it's so important to achieve that reform for the environment itself, but also for industry. They want certainty. The state governments, of course, here in WA, but right around the country, and the territory governments also want certainty as well. So there's much to be gained in undertaking this reform and doing it in a productive and efficient manner, and I know that's what will happen.
Re-elected Teals MPs will be keeping a close eye on this area of reform, as well as many others, as the government now must deliver on the promises it made during the election. I'm joined now by Independent MP for Wentworth, Allegra Spender. Allegra Spender, thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thank you for having me.
Firstly, on those environmental reforms, obviously they were sidelined in the last parliament. Are you confident, are you hopeful that we can see some action in this coming parliament?
Look, I think they're absolutely critical because we know that those environmental laws are broken, and we know that is both holding back protection of the environment, but it's also holding back certainty for business, including on clean energy projects. So this law reform is really critical, and this is an area that I will be pushing very strongly to see done, and done early in this term.
Okay, on another topic now, the Treasurer Jim Chalmers says Labor will push ahead with its delayed super tax plan, despite your calls for a rethink. Now, for viewers at home, this impacts people with more than $3 million in their super accounts. The government claims that the changes are modest and would mostly impact politicians and public servants. A lot of people watching at home might think that's fair enough, though.
Sure. Look, I think this is a bit, maybe it's a bit of a complicated subject. So what I think the government has, I think, achieved a mandate to reform high value super balances. And, you know, talking to many voters in Wentworth, you know, that is not that contested as much as the way that the government is doing this. Because the government's doing something which is really unusual. It's taxing unrealised gains. So most of the time people expect to pay tax on gains that they realise. So if they own a house, an investment property or something, and they sell it, they pay tax, when they sell the property. If they own some shares that go up and down, but when they sell them, then they pay tax on, any gains that they make. But the government in this case is proposing to tax unrealised gains. So paper profits that people may never see. And so this is really unconventional, and I don't think is a modest change, because the government has also said it won't index this. And so by some estimates, the average 22-year-old, by the time they get their super, they will be also taxed on unrealised gains. So I don't think the government has made the argument of why it's departing so much from convention in tax policy to tax unrealised gains, and certainly, hasn't made the argument, beyond, in terms of how it's going to deal with unintended consequences, including on investment in areas such as startups, which often rely on super funds to invest in those areas, and those startups often have their gains go up and down quite a lot. So I think this is an opportunity, I think, for the government to do some rethinking. They may have the mandate, but it doesn't mean it's good policy.
So how much is that aspect of unrealised gains a sticking point for you? Is that the main issue that you have with this policy as a whole?
Look, I think the unrealised gains is certainly the biggest issue that people have been approaching me around, as well as the fact that it's not indexed, because the lack of indexing, is effectively just bracket creep by another name. But that unrealised taxation, it's bad policy. I just don't think that people should be paying tax on profits they may never see. And plus, if the asset goes down in value again, the government's not paying that tax back to the person. The government's keeping that tax. So I just don't think that's very fair, and I don't think that's a principle of our tax system. I think this is a fundamental principle that the government is violating in this case.
To be fair to the government, it does have a mandate, so shouldn't that be respected?
Sure, I appreciate it has a mandate, but it does, as I said, it doesn't make a good policy. And the Treasurer has also said, they're really focused on productivity, which they need to be, because productivity growth is what really drives the economy. But we know that it is young, startup, high growth firms that are often really driving productivity. And some of the firms that I'm really concerned are going to be impacted unintendedly, but impacted by these sorts of changes. So I want to see the government take a proactive stance in how we get capital to young, high-growth, entrepreneurial, innovative firms, rather than take steps that actually could make it harder for those sorts of firms to raise capital. And this is one of the big challenges, I think, with this legislation.
You argue that the tax system broadly is too reliant on personal income. So don't you think measures like this are part of the solution, though?
Sure, I am open to, as I said, I've always been open to looking at the tax system, including super and other areas, to rebalance the tax system away from income taxes on young people, because that is a real problem with our tax system. But it doesn't mean taxing unrealised gains, something that we don't do in other parts of the tax system, particularly not at 30%. Like, this is not a small amount of tax on unrealised gains. This is a 30% tax on unrealised gains. We don't do that in any part of our tax system. So just because it's a change doesn't mean it's necessarily a good one. And I still urge the government to put a broader agenda around tax reform on the table. They do have a significant majority. They do have a Senate pathway open to them. This is the time for them to show their ability to reform, both to make sure that young people can get ahead, but also that we drive investment and drive productivity in our economy as well. And the tax system is critical to that.
Can we go to climate change action in this new parliament? Sussan Ley says the climate wars are over. Given the coalition has put net zero up for review, are you hopeful that the climate wars are over?
Well, look, I think that you can't say the climate wars are over and we're not sure if we're going to hold on to 2050 targets. I mean, net zero. I think that really is deep concern. And I think there should be a question, I think, with the Liberals on whether they, it is in their interests to continue to have their climate policy dictated by the National Party, or whether this is maybe the time, as Matt Canavan says, maybe the Nationals should go alone. Maybe the Liberals should choose this moment to cast, forge their own path in relation to climate policy and maybe broader policy, because we can't be half in, half out on net zero by 2050, but say that the climate wars are over. There's a transition that we are going through, that we need to go through. And frankly, business needs certainty, households need certainty, and we need to transition in the lowest cost way possible. And the coalition should be on board with that. And if they're not, that is extremely problematic and is, the Parliament has been re-elected. It backs climate action. It is time for the coalition to get on board. And if the Nats can't get on board, then the Libs should go their own.
The government's yet to unveil its 2035 target. Before the election, the Climate Authority said it needed more time to consider that target, given that there was the return of the Trump administration. Is that good enough for you? And when would you like to see Labor unveil this target?
Look, we want to see this target unveiled as soon as possible because, again, it's not just the targets, it's then all the policies that are going to underpin the target. I was disappointed that wasn't released before the election, but the Climate Change Authority is an independent body, and so it is up to them to come back with a target. But I want to see the government really go for the top of that range, and I hope very much that we do end up with a target of, in the range that we saw previously in the interim target from the Climate Change Authority of around 65 to 75% reduction. I'd love to see the government make a commitment at the top end of the range and then put in place the policies to drive that at a sector by sector level, because that is what is required right now. And that's what also the business community needs to make the investments for us to be able to reach those targets. We need that certainty, and the business community needs that certainty.
Allegra Spender, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much for having me.
Acting Prime Minister Richard Marles visited an urgent care clinic in Western Australia today, but almost all the questions during the press conference were about dumped Cabinet Ministers Mark Dreyfus and Ed Husic. Richard Marles was asked if Mr Husic's labelling of him as a factional assassin was a fair assessment.
I don't accept that. These are collective processes. As I said, they are obviously difficult processes, but at the end of the day, we don't need to go through the process of choosing a ministry in the context of there being a lot of talented people who can perform the role, and I'm really confident about the ministry that has been chosen.
To unpack this and more, Labor MP for Solomon Luke Gosling joins us now. Luke Gosling, thank you for speaking with us.
Yeah, good to be with you from Darwin.
Your colleague Ed Husick has labelled Defence Minister Richard Marles as a factional assassin for the deal that removed him and Mark Dreyfus from the front bench. Are you comfortable with the way they were treated?
Look, I think as Richard Marles said in that piece you just put on, we are a big team in Labor these days, the biggest since Federation, and there's certainly a lot of talent there. Anyone who knows the Labor Party well knows that factions have a role in the way that things are distributed and organised. And there are often people who advance as a result of that and people who don't. But it's like my wife and I tell our kids, you know, you get what you get and you don't get upset and you just continue to focus on the mission that we've got and that sort of trust that the Australian people's put in us to focus on our jobs, and you get on with things and you sort things out along the way with your colleagues.
It does taint a pretty emphatic win for Labor though, doesn't it?
Look, the Australian people have given us an overwhelming mandate to do all the things that we said we would do during the election campaign and in the 3 years prior to that. So I'm incredibly proud to have a role in defence, veterans and Northern Australia within the Albanese Labor government, and that's where my focus is. And I think as we get towards putting our first legislation through to knock 20% off the HECS debts of young people around our country, young and old, whoever has a HECS debt, we will come together as a team and be focused on delivering for Australia.
So do you think you'll be able to effectively advocate for Darwin and the NT in your role as Special Envoy? And what are the top priorities for you there?
Yeah, well, I had been in the role of Special Envoy for Defence, Veterans in Northern Australia, and obviously there is a good overlap there, given that $18 billion in the decade ahead is going to be spent on preparing our bases, hardening and networking and connecting our supply lines throughout Northern Australia. So we're prepared not only to assist with the development of Northern Australia, but to be prepared for future challenges. I had already been doing that work with Richard Marles, with Matt Keogh, the Veterans Minister, and with Madeleine King, the Minister for Northern Australia. So that work will continue. And when it comes to big issues like bringing the Port of Darwin back into Australian hands, that's something that I've been pushing for a long time, that the Prime Minister and I have been working on, and I'll continue to work on achieving that with my colleagues, as well as making sure that across Northern Australia we are prepared, as I said, for the challenges of the future. There are many issues to deal with in defence, including recruiting and retention. Your viewers might even remember that I was very much a part of the push for a Royal Commission into defence and veterans issues. Those recommendations I'll be helping to implement now, and as a fourth generation veteran and as a former serving Army officer, I'm obviously very aware of our responsibility to be prepared for the challenges of the future and for working with our allies and partners. So obviously I speak Bahasa Indonesia. 3 years ago I was with the Prime Minister over in Jakarta when the first bilateral trip he had then, as he is doing now, is to visit the Indonesian President and to discuss our shared responsibilities and also our shared interests in the region.
And the government, you mentioned your area of veteran affairs. The government has spent billions in addressing the backlog of veterans' compensation claims. At one point, it reached 60,000 unprocessed claims. So how confident are you that this can be further addressed in this term?
Yeah, extremely confident. We've already made sure that that the cases that were there backlogged for a long time, and it's to the eternal shame of the Liberal, or the coalition and the Liberals and the Nationals, that they allowed Australian patriots who have served our country and had claims in to just, be essentially unaddressed for years in many cases. And there's a direct correlation between that and the suicides that we saw, the deaths by suicide, that meant that we had to look into it in a meaningful and systematic way, so that we ensure that those who sign up to serve our country are looked after, from recruiting all the way through to their transition back into civilian life, and so that we look after our people, and importantly, we look after their families.
At the last election, Labor committed to take back a Chinese firm's lease of the Darwin Port. Obviously, it is a legally challenging thing to do. So what does this process look like now that you have been re-elected?
Well, as I mentioned, been working on it for some time. I was obviously disgusted when the CLP NT government in 2015 colluded with elements of the coalition federal government to lease the Port of Darwin for 99 years to a foreign company, in this case a Chinese company called Lambridge. Now, Lambridge have done a reasonable job of running the port. They've made some good profits. There's been some concerns about their liquidity, but there hasn't been the investment in our Port of Darwin that we need. And more than that, I think our allies and partners understand that we want to have such a critical piece of infrastructure in Australian hands. It's a sovereign asset. So the Prime Minister's been clear that we'll return that, and even for the last couple of months and more, I've been talking to Australian companies, including super funds, but some defence industry companies as well, about their strong interest in taking over the lease. Obviously, that'll need to be under terms where it sees Lambridge, the current owner of a 99 or now 89-year lease on the port, to receive a return on their investment. That's only proper, but I guess the difference between us and what Peter Dutton was suggesting during the campaign is that we'll do so respecting the Australian taxpayer, i.e. there is a commercial deal to be made here for an Australian entity to take back that lease under fair terms. And then obviously our role as the Australian government is to assist with that process and to also assist with some of the infrastructure development that will make our port more efficient and more effective and more secure into the future.
On the opposite argument of this, a group of Chinese Australians in Darwin, the Australia-China Friendship Society, says that the move will hurt the NT's economy and lead to local community groups losing out on financial support. Is that a valid concern, do you think?
I've spoken with them about their concerns and allayed any fears that they had that this was motivated by some sort of anti-China stance. It is true that the port lease owners, Lambridge, were supporting a number of local organisations such as the Australia-China Friendship Society in the Northern Territory. But there are plenty of good companies here in the north and perhaps even the future Australian leaseholder that will continue to support our great community organisations. But the point I made to them and I make to your viewers is that Australia has, the current Australian government under Anthony Albanese with Penny Wong and Richard Marles and our great leadership team have stabilised our trading relationship with China, and that is a good thing. And we also are not suggesting that we conduct any sort of megaphone diplomacy and beat our chests and say that we're going to rip the port back under anything other than terms that are reasonable. I think that was a concern for many people in the rhetoric that are perhaps desperate. Peter Dutton was trying to say that it would happen in 6 months or else. You've got a more mature, sensible and strategically diplomatic federal government in ours, and we will manage the return of the Darwin Port to Australian hands in a much more appropriate and effective way.
Okay, Luke Gosling, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time.
Fantastic to be with you. Cheers.
A day after Sussan Ley was elected opposition leader, Liberal frontbencher Andrew Hastie revealed his desire to one day lead the party. He told Sky now wasn't the right time for his young family.
It's a challenge with a young family, as you'd know. I've got a 9-year-old, a 7-year-old and a 3-year-old. I spoke to my wife, Ruth, and it was very clear that I wasn't in a position to lead and be a good dad and husband at the same time. You only get one shot at it, and I decided that I owe that to my family first and foremost.
Now, she faced a tough battle for the seat of Flinders, but Liberal MP Zoe McKenzie has been re-elected and joins us now. Zoe, welcome to Afternoon Briefing and congratulations on your re-election.
Thank you, Pablo, and it's nice to join you.
On those comments, firstly from Andrew Hastie, do you see him as a future leader of the party?
Look, Andrew is a sensational colleague, an enormous amount of talent, dedication, a brilliant man with an extraordinary history of service to our country. Andrew's still young. He's only been in the parliament for 10 years. He'll be there for 20 odd, I reckon. And he's got a great future ahead of us. I think one day he may well be the leader of our party, but may I say, I'm very happy with the leadership team that we got this week. They're doing the right thing, they're listening, they're engaging, and they're encountering the result we got with a great deal of humility and a great deal of energy for what we need to do as a party going forward.
Yeah, so on the election of Sussan Ley as Liberal leader this week, do you believe that she has what it takes to turn the party's electoral fortunes around?
I absolutely believe that Sussan and Ted have the ability to get us in the strongest possible place for the next election. We really must look at the platform of policies that we took to the Australian electorate, but we must also think about the changing nature of Australian elections. We have a huge majority for the Labor Party, but it only got 34% of the primary vote. Others, so not Labor, not Liberal, got about 33, and we as a party got about 32. Well, the coalition got about 32. Australian politics is changing and has changed forever. We must think about how we approach. It's not a Labor versus Liberal competition anymore. It is absolutely about re-engaging the Australian population with the democracy, with how it works, with what we both can offer as parties of government, because one way or the other, one party or one side will form government, and what that means for people's livelihoods. A lot of people were coming to the polling booth a couple of weeks ago not really understanding what the federal government does, not really understanding the differences or indeed what have been put on the table for people to consider. So it's really important that we sort of start with a clean page and think about how we engage with Australians across the political spectrum and the demographic spectrum as well.
So earlier this week, Dave Sharma said that he was worried what a close vote on the leadership could mean for the opposition. So it was 29 for Sussan Ley, 25 for Angus Taylor. Are you worried given that clear divide within the party?
Absolutely not. What I see that as is an indicator that we have extraordinary talent. Angus Taylor is one of the smartest blokes you'll ever meet in Australian public life. And Jacinta is an enormous motivator of spirit and passion and pride in our country. I think it's terrific. And then Phil Thompson, who, as you probably read in the paper, was last minute edition, an exceptional human, one of the best retail politicians I know, absolutely loved by his community in Townsville. So I actually looked at that as an offering of great talent within our party room. We're a stripped back party room. We've lost exceptional members of parliament like Keith Woolahan, my dear friend. Let's hope he comes back. But we still have such extraordinary talent at the top. And I think that competition between Sussan, Ted, Jacinta, Angus and indeed Phil just showed what an amazing future we have in front of us with people like that who are willing to lean in and rebuild the coalition and particularly the Liberal Party.
But we all know how politics works. You don't think Jacinta Price, Angus Taylor will be agitating for the leadership if things don't go well over the next couple of years?
What I saw was the conversation between colleagues after that event was a classy one, a gracious one and a grateful one. Grateful to be there and understanding the task that sits in front of all of us. We all bear a responsibility for the outcome on the 3rd of May. I see my responsibility in terms of how to move things forward, how to contribute to my party platform, but especially to continue to fight for Flinders and to make sure that what we need down here is fully understood by decision makers, both on the coalition side and on the government side as well. I think I started advocating for my community in the plane home on Tuesday afternoon. The poor cabinet minister who was sitting next to me on the plane copped an earful.
What do you make of this idea around Sussan Ley being put on the so-called glass cliff? For our viewers, it's a phenomenon where women are most likely put into leadership positions when their organisation is pretty much on the precipice of disaster. What do you make of that observation being made about Sussan Ley now being installed to the Liberal leadership?
Pablo, I think people like to say that, but that's just an unnecessary consideration. The Liberal Party has been around for 81 years. And we have never had a female leader. I'm very proud to be part of that party room now that is led by a woman. And may I say, I have an office filled with extraordinarily talented, dedicated, passionate Liberal women. And the response I've had from them has been very terrific, excited, proud that we are being led by a woman. Same thing in my young Liberal membership. I was reading an excellent email from a young Liberal woman in my electorate and her real excitement about what this might mean. So I'm already seeing change on the ground in terms of people's enthusiasm for our mission, particularly people under 30. So it's a very good day to find ourselves led by a woman. Sussan has all the accomplishments needed. She's not there because of quotas or anything else. She's there because of abject talent and her ability to be the best person to do a lot of listening together with Ted O'Brien, particularly as we digest the what and why of the election result 10 days ago.
You just mentioned quotas. What about the challenge the Liberal Party now has with attracting women to the party, retaining them? Do you think quotas is something that the party needs to consider?
Look, I think all options need to be on the table. I've always been nervous about quotas only because I couldn't bear to be somebody about whom it was said she only got there because of a quota, and that's the terrible potential consequence of implementing them in a cack-handed way. So we must look at how we bring more women into the party. May I say we had an extraordinary list of women who are candidates for this election. We've already doubled the number of Liberal women in the lower house in Victoria overnight with the election of Mary Aldred, who's a good friend of mine. I'm watching the count in Bradfield as excitedly as possible. I've worked with Giselle Capterian. She's an extraordinary professional, a brilliant public policy maker, and will make a great contribution to the party room if she manages to hold her lead in Bradfield. And I think just having women of that talent and that eventual impact on Australia's future will help us to make sure the next generation of women are putting their hands up. I do know that having found myself as the only Liberal woman in the lower house in Victoria for the Liberal Party, so many young women and middle-aged women, frankly, have come to me and asked for advice about running for the Liberal Party, and that is a responsibility I take very seriously and will continue to do.
On the election more broadly, what do you think went wrong for the Liberal Party? You were able to retain your seat, but where did it go wrong from your perspective?
Look, I think in particular in a seat like mine, we had to get the policy out earlier, I think. One of the challenges was a lot of really important policies for Flinders, like small business and entrepreneurship, was coming out literally on the eve of the election. And it's very hard at that point to get that into people's minds. A lot of our written material, it's important electorate for written material, was already done and dusted and locked in at the time that we announced big changes on things like the ute tax, etc. So we had to do it all earlier. We had to be making the case for some time, I think, before the election. And I also think we needed to explain our leadership team more. You know, I had a lot of people coming in on polling day who said, I don't really know what I'm doing here at all. They had all these how to votes in their hands. They were clearly perplexed. I noticed there is a decline in civic awareness in this country, in understanding what it's the federal government's job to do, the state government's job to do, and our local council to do. We really need to do more to build civics education in this country, because I was literally explaining to people how the federal government works at pre-poll, in the queue. We must do more to make sure people understand what our offering is, what we can do to deliver, how we propose to deliver for them. And so that's something that must be started much, much earlier. And I think much deeper engagement with the party room about policy formulation. You know, I've worked in policy on and off for 25 years across communications, trade and tourism, Attorney General's portfolio, education, science and training. There's an enormous wealth of policy expertise in our party room, and we just need to make sure we harness all of it.
Zoe McKenzie, thank you for your insights. We appreciate your time.
Thank you, Pablo.
As you heard earlier, Queensland Senator Larissa Waters is the new leader of the Greens following the shock defeat of Adam Bandt at the recent election. Along with Mr Bandt's lower house seat of Melbourne, the Greens also lost 2 Queensland seats, Griffith and Melbourne. And last term, they lost a senator to Lydia Thorpe, who quit the party and now sits as an independent. I spoke to her just before the Greens party room vote and started by asking about reports in the Australian newspaper that the Senator Thorpe was eyeing a return to the party.
Even if my daughter became the leader of the Greens, I would not join the Greens. Absolutely not. I left the Greens for very, very good reasons, and I have no intention on returning. And good luck to them, in all honesty. I love being an independent. I get to decide, what is best based on the Black Sovereign movement guiding me. And sometimes that doesn't sit well with the Greens. So I left for good reasons, and good luck to them. I have no intentions of going there.
On the election result, it was a disappointing result for the Greens. Labor framed the party as obstructive in the last parliament. How damaging do you think that was?
Look, it was a very high vote, as from what I've been told, and Labor's lowest vote. It's just how the elections run. It's a colonial space that we're working in after all. I think more people in this country care about the climate than not. And Labor run dirty campaigns. Labor ran campaigns that were lying to the voters, and people were scared of a Dutton government and put their votes in Labor rather than the Greens and minor parties and independents, progressive independents, that should be there to hold Labor accountable. Labor say that they are doing all these great things, but look at how they vote in the chamber. They are complicit in the genocide that's going on in Palestine. They are complicit in the ongoing genocide of First Peoples in this country. They won't implement in full the recommendations of the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody. They do nothing about child removals, yet, they're closing the gap. Campaign or program is failing, and it will continue to fail because governments won't act. And we have an opportunity in the next 3 years.
I want to get to some of those points you made, but just lastly on the Greens, do you make of the criticism that the party veered away from its core on issues like the environment? And yes, it did have a relatively stable vote, but it has gone backwards.
No, I don't agree with that. I think we need more people to stand up against any genocide going on, against any group of people, and that's what the Greens have done. They've stood up against racism, particularly Senator Faruqi, and they've maintained their stance on the environment and climate. And they've pushed to be better on housing. I was with them. I often vote with the Greens. So I know what they've stood for in the last 3 years. It's not what Labor say. And I think that, they can only strengthen within and have more seats in the next election. But so can independents like myself and other minor parties.
Senator, you mentioned the closing the gap policy. What hope do you have around policies of closing the gap between non-Indigenous and Indigenous Australians in this Parliament?
Well, look, it's a sad state of affairs, really, when you have, a Minister for Indigenous Australians who doesn't do much at all except for give crumbs on the table, which is what we're used to as black people in this country. We need a minister that's going to act and make a real difference, particularly around justice issues. We have, the highest incarceration rates, the highest suicide rates, poorest people in our own country. The removal rate has gone through the roof and continues to rise, all under Labor. So, the Minister herself can't answer questions in question time. She doesn't return the letters I've written to question her about, what is she going to do about these damning rates. And she's got to toe the line at the end of the day. She's got to bow to the colonial master, who is a white man. And that's the problem in this colony. The continuation of this sophistication of this genocide is real. Look up the definition of genocide. And that's what's happening to Aboriginal people in this country.
As an Indigenous Australian, how did you feel seeing the kind of culture wars that we saw play out during the election campaign? Things like Peter Dutton's raising issues with the acknowledgement of country, saying that it's been overused, and his stance of only standing in front of one flag. How did you feel when you saw that play out publicly through the campaign?
Well, as a mother and a grandmother who's, about to turn 52, I've seen this all my life. It is no different to what we've been dealing with and what my old people have been dealing with. It's just another day in the colony, as Chelsea Wattergo would say. So if it's not Dutton, it's Albo. One's, a overt racist political party, and one's a covert racist political party. They've both done nothing to give justice or bring justice to First Peoples in this country ever in their history of the parliament. So what difference does it make? Next election, they'll run some other scare campaign. Labor are no different. Labor took us to a referendum that we should never have had, because we don't have a treaty in this country. So we don't want to go into their constitution when we don't have a treaty. And the country's too racist to reconcile. So the referendum was always going to fail. And unfortunately, the racists have jumped on that wagon, and we're dealing with the ramifications of that every day.
Senator Thorpe, just quickly, firstly, I think Labor and the Liberal Party would dispute that they are a racist party. But very quickly, can I just get your views? You faced widespread criticism in the last parliament for heckling the King. You were suspended from the Senate as well. Do you think you'll do things differently in this parliament?
No, I think I'll continue to bring down the colony. I think I'll continue to tell the truth, which obviously hurts these politicians and the racists in this country. So I will continue to be the activist that I am, and I'll continue to fight for justice for my people.
Senator Lydia Thorpe, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Independent Senator Lydia Thorpe there. She made several references to genocide in Gaza. That is a claim Israel has consistently and strenuously denied. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has met with his Indonesian counterpart Prabowo Subianto during his first overseas trip since being re-elected. Foreign Affairs reporter Stephen Jedget is travelling with the Prime Minister and joins us now. Stephen, what do we know about the discussions between the Prime Minister and his Indonesian counterpart?
Well, not that much at the moment. The Prime Minister and Prabowo Subianto, the President, have just emerged and given a joint statement. Now, much of that joint statement dealt, as is often the case in the diplomatic universe, in niceties and generalities. So we heard a lot from the Prime Minister about the importance of the bilateral relationship, and similarly from Prabowo Subianto. He was very keen to stress just how central Australia is to Indonesia's strategy for the region and beyond. A few things worth touching on briefly, particularly in the economic space. Anthony Albanese, in his final statement there with Prabowo Subianto, seemed to concede that the economic relationship hasn't developed at the same rate that the strategic and, in particular, more recently, the military relationship has developed between Indonesia and Australia. He said there was nothing inevitable about Australia and Indonesia bolstering economic ties at the same time that Indonesia undergoes this extraordinary growth. He said the only only way that the two countries can take advantage of that extraordinary potential is by making sure that all parts of society, from civil society to government and perhaps most pointedly to business, really put their shoulder to the wheel. And that seemed to be a reflection of the fact that Australian business and super funds in particular haven't been moving quickly enough for the government's taste. They've been really typically sticking in some of their traditional markets and investment sources in the US and Europe. Anthony Albanese would like them to look really hard at Southeast Asia instead, but convincing them to do that is no easy step. One other thing on the trade front, which I think was interesting and is worth noting, is that Anthony Albanese said that Australia would support Indonesia's bid to join the CPTPP. That's a sprawling trade agreement that takes in more than a dozen countries around the region. That could have some significance because Indonesia has indicated that it does want to join that group. If that happens, that's got consequences not just for the trade bloc, but for the geopolitical balance in the region as well.
And Stephen, on those geopolitical issues in the region, what about security? Do we know if Anthony Albanese brought up the issue of Russia, which became prominent during the federal election?
We don't know for sure. Anthony Albanese was asked multiple times during his press conference before his meeting with Prabowo Subianto whether he would raise this issue and the reports that circulated around the election time of Russia trying to get a bit of a military foothold in Indonesia, specifically basing some of its long-range aircraft out of a military base in Papua. Now, Anthony Albanese has simply pointed to the fact that Indonesia has made it clear that this will not happen. He has not denied that Australia may have intelligence, pointing to the fact that some sort of approach was made. How serious that approach was is not particularly clear. He's also declined to say whether he would raise that with Prabowo, so it's not clear whether he used his opportunity either in his informal or his formal meetings with Prabowo Subianto to make it clear that that would be a bit of a red line for Australia, or at least something that would really alarm Australian officials and potentially endanger the relationship between Australia and Indonesia as well. But there's no doubt that Australia's watching what Moscow's doing quite closely. This isn't new. For decades, Indonesia and Moscow have had military links, but you do get the sense with Prabowo Subianto in charge, a man who's keen to strike partnerships with as many countries as possible, that Russia possibly does spot an opportunity there. That's certainly something that Australia is determined to try and head off.
Stephen Jedgetts, thank you for that update. Joining us now to discuss the Prime Minister's trip to Indonesia is Hal Hill, a Professor of Southeast Asian Economies at the Australian National University. Professor, thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thanks, Pablo. Hello.
Hi there. So how significant is it that the Prime Minister has made this his first international trip after being re-elected?
It's symbolically important. Prime Ministers' visits lead to initiatives which other visits don't. So it's welcome. Whether it amounts to anything really substantial remains to be seen. The context really matters on the visit. Both countries tend to look north. The relationship is largely trouble-free, but there's also a sense of complacency in the bilateral relationship at both ends.
We saw President Prabowo Subianto share video on social media of his call with Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. What do we know about the relationship at that top diplomatic level?
The relationship at the top diplomatic level is fine. I think the issue is what's behind the very competent high-level diplomatic work on both sides. Both sides have very competent foreign ministries and ambassadors. On the Australian side, our economic presence is really tiny, as Stephen, your reporter, just mentioned. We don't come across on the radar screen on Indonesian business. And Indonesia, let's remember, is a developing country with a huge agenda. It's looking for partners with money. And we haven't really been at the table for quite a long time. So that's an issue. Another issue is that our expertise on Indonesia in this country is gradually slipping away. We have fewer students at high school and universities studying Indonesian now than we did have in the 1970s. So it's a harmonious relationship, but one which is really sort of on autopilot, I think it's fair to say.
Does Australia need to be more ambitious in its bilateral relationship with Indonesia?
Yes, it could and it should. As I mentioned, our deep core expertise on the country is slipping away. You know, students studying, exchange of people, the economic relationship is really very weak. It's important just to mention on the economic relationship, the government is really trying to push things along, but in the end it's going to be private business calculus which determines what happens. And our business community tends to still want to invest in the old familiar markets, New Zealand, UK, US. In Southeast Asia, we're pretty small, and most of it anyway in Southeast Asia goes to Singapore, which is, as we know, less than 1% of the total population of the region. So our business, I think, unless it really has a longer time horizon and it isn't in for the quick fix, I think it's going to remain seriously under potential.
And what do we know about President Prabowo's leadership and his outlook on the world stage? How does he position Indonesia?
That's a really important issue, I think. He is unlike any previous Indonesian president. He's less cautious than his predecessors, except for the very first one, President Sukarno. He's less predictable than his predecessors. He's potentially bolder than his predecessors. So he's someone who, if we can get on the right wavelength, there could be some really important initiatives. We just have to see how it's going to develop. He's now been in power for a bit over 6 months. On economics, for example, we're not yet getting a coherent sort of read of what he's like. He's made a lot of statements and they don't all hang together. So it's work in progress, I think, and it's important. The other point just to note is that both of us want something else from the other country, in a sense. We would like greater access to the Indonesian market. Indonesia is still quite protectionist in lots of areas of export interest to us. And Indonesia would like a lot more access to our labour market. We have a lot of Indonesian students studying in Australia, and there'd be huge benefits potentially from these students graduating and staying here, working here, picking up skills and developing deep familiarity with both countries. So there's lots of potential, I think, if there's a bit more creativity in both governments.
Professor Halhill, just very quickly, if there's one thing that you think Australia could achieve from this meeting, what do you think it is Anthony Albanese might want to get out of this trip?
More exchanges, especially exchanges of students. I mean, they are the future of the relationship. The diplomatic relationship is fine. It's the next level down, the next generation of students at high school and universities.
Professor Halhill, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thanks. You're welcome.
And that is afternoon briefing for today. Stay with us here on ABC News. Joe O'Brien is up next with today's top stories. See you soon.